But I believe that by overwhelming majority in all the Americas, you and I, in the long run, and if it be necessary, you and I will act together to protect, to defend, by every means at our command.
Welcome to the History in Motion podcast, where we discuss leaders, their decisions, and how they shape the world we live in today. In this episode of the History in Motion podcast, we journey back to the early 20th century to explore the life and legacy of Marie Curie, one of the most remarkable scientists of all time. Known not just for her groundbreaking discoveries in radioactivity, but also her profound impact on science and society, Curie's contributions fundamentally changed our understanding of chemistry and physics. Join us as we delve into Curie's early life, marked by a brilliant mind born into a time of limited opportunities for women in science. We explore her determination to pursue higher education in Paris and her collaboration with her husband, Pierre Curie, which led to the discovery of polonium and radium. With insights from leading scholars and dramatic recountings of her pivotal moments, we paint a picture of Marie Curie's significant battles, both in the laboratory and in the societal arena. Tune into this episode and experience the extraordinary life of a brilliant mind who not only revolutionized our understanding of radioactivity, but also paved the way for future scientists advocating for a world of discovery and equality.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the History in Motion podcast, where we're continuing down our line of scientists this week. And, going into this, I knew a lot about Marie Curie. I knew she was quite accomplished, but, coming back to back with Einstein, I thought it might have been a bit of a step down just based on, it's Einstein. He's always kind of put at the top level. But I really think Marie Curie and Einstein could go toe to toe in a great scientist kind of battle here. And I think as we studied her more, we realized that not just as a scientist, but just if you take all of her accomplishments together, she's not only one of the probably greatest scientists of all time, but just one of the greatest just people in general for all of her accomplishments. So I'm really excited to get into her life, because there's so much here on not just science, but involvement in war and just the impact in even today's world that we can trace back there is pretty wild, all coming from, a small area in Poland and moving to a new country at such a young age. It's a really, really interesting journey. So I'm excited to get into this one.
I think that's such a good point around her standing equal footing with Einstein, right? I don't think most people would make that comparison. It would be that kind of like Einstein and then everybody else just because of pop culture. But the more you learn about her, I think the more you can appreciate the contribution she made to the scientific community, but also socially, which we'll get into. And I think, she led a remarkable life. I think that's a good word for it. Yeah,
and I think one thing people might see coming into this is she's always touted as the first woman to do this, the first woman to do that. But I think that takes away a little bit from her accomplishments. Like, she is standing toe to toe with these scientists, on top of the fact that she has to go through all the barriers that a woman of the late 1800s, early 1900s would go through. Which, if she didn't have those barriers, you always like to think, like, if she didn't have those barriers, would she have been as successful as she was because she had to power through, or would she have been even more successful because she just kind of had a straighter lane to the finish line? So it's always something I think that's interesting.
I think in her case, as we'll probably spell out quite clearly for our listeners, if she didn't have those obstacles, I think she would have accomplished exponentially more than she already has.
Yeah, you might be right. But there's a point in here, I'm just remembering, that she may have gone back to Poland if she didn't have to go through those barriers. And who knows how that would have changed her life. But with that being said, let's get into her life a little bit. So Marie Curie, she's known as, a French scientist, but she's actually born in Poland. And if you were to ask her, she was definitely very, very proud of being Polish. So she was born in Warsaw, Poland on November 7th, 1867. So the thing to remember about Poland at this time is Poland was a very powerful empire in Eastern Europe. They had the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth for a long time, and Poland really had a tight grip around that neck of the woods. However, as time went on, the Prussians and the Germans started to move east, and then the Russians really start to get on the scene. And as we see, if anybody knows any World War II history, it didn't end well for the Polish people when the Russians and the Germans were coming up both sides. And this is kind of the first time we really see it happen, where she's born into a world that remembers this free Poland, but it is really under the boot of the Russian Empire. So she's not growing up in a free society by any stretch of the imagination. The Polish people are definitely oppressed by the Russians, and the Russian Empire is really trying to gain control. They know there's this Polish nationalistic movement there. The Polish people want to be independent again, but to maintain control of the space, the Russians are really pushing down and cracking down on a lot of things in Poland at this time.
I think that's a really good point to probably re-emphasize, like for our listeners and even for us. Imagine growing up in a world that is essentially partitioned amongst three of the most powerful European empires at this time. You have Russia, Prussia, and Austria. And under like when Curie is born and comes onto the scene, it's under tight Russian control with a very oppressive environment with very limited freedoms for the Poles that, you know, have that national identity still.
It's a theme you see a lot with the Russian Empire at this time as it starts to grow and take these territories. You know, these people are not Russian by any stretch of the imagination, and they are seeing themselves as these more independent areas. And for the Poles, right, like you were saying, being sandwiched between these massive empires, it's almost like they're trying to see who can take control of that. And, you know, the other thing too is Poland ends up becoming kind of this buffer state, but nobody wants to leave the buffer state open to whatever's going to happen, right? You would want to be the one who can control that state. So if anything does go wrong, you can figure it out. So with all that going on, her family that she grew up to on both sides, they had lost property and fortunes through patriotic involvements in Polish national uprising aimed at restoring this Polish independence. Her father was a physics teacher, staunch atheist, and a patriot. So very different for this time, and other than being a patriot, but not very religious. And you can see too, has this scientific background, but he's kind of dead set on having an independent Poland. And this will start to affect his career. And so if we think of communists during kind of the McCarthy era and stuff like that, you're labeled as, you know, you're not kind of going with the status quo the way the government wants you to go through. It's going to have some issues as you go along your life. And so he struggled to hold down a job throughout a lot of his life. He was able to teach physics and do a lot of that stuff, but, you know, it wasn't a very stable life for him. Her mother, on the other hand, grew up in a boarding school, and Maria grew up in a boarding school with her very Catholic mother. So she's kind of getting two sides of this. She's kind of getting the, hey, just kind of head down, science is science, and that's all we see, versus someone who's very, very religious. So she's kind of getting both sides to this, and she was very close to her mother. So, you know, life is going on for her, but unfortunately, Marie turns 11. Her mother passes away from tuberculosis. So this is a really tough time for Marie. And what she does is she actually takes refuge in her father's laboratory, puts herself into this like state of just probably being preoccupied, staying with a loved one, and kind of as a way to distract herself. And this kind of gets her off on this scientific journey a little bit. And as time goes on, she goes to boarding school where she excels. She wins a gold medal at her grammar school for girls in 1883. So she's already kind of being seen as, you know, someone who's clearly academically very talented. She wasn't able, though, to go to the University of Warsaw because she was a woman at the time. Only men were allowed. But she continued her studies in something called the Flying University. So the Flying University was this underground movement in Warsaw. So it was an illegal night school that got its name from the fact that its classes met in changing locations because they wanted to avoid the Russian authorities. Its students' lofty goal was not just self-improvement. They hoped that this grassroots educational movement would educate the young Polish people and then eventually lead to eventual Polish liberation. So you can see why the Russian authorities were very much against this, and they were trying to move around a lot. But I think it goes to show that she's the type of person where she obviously values education so much, and she loves her country so much at the same time, that she's willing to go through these risks to get ahead and get to a point where she can be highly educated. People around her can be highly educated, but all working towards a goal of being, you know, the best highly educated Polish people they can, and get to a point where they can be free again.
I think that's such a great nuanced point. One, just her dedication to education, learning, growth, but also in the same vein, like the environment she's growing up in, to be able to attend these underground classes, because, you know, if she gets caught, she's going to end up in a labor camp, best case scenario, if not dead.
Yeah, they're definitely not messing around at this time, right?
No.
And yeah, like the risk is absolutely astronomical, right? Of this isn't just, yeah, you're going to get a slap on the wrist, or sorry, you can't go to university because you're a woman. This is, no, you're doing something illegal on kind of two fronts, you know, trying to educate yourself as a woman, but also trying to be part of something that's part of a Polish independence movement. It's not going to go well with the authorities. And you're right. There's plenty of work camps in Siberia where I'm sure they would they would like to send some of these people. So yeah, it's tough.
Well, I think it's another good point, and that we'll see throughout her story, is this kind of like duality that exists between her like academic and intellectual pursuits and the nationalistic sentiment that kind of underpin her entire journey. And you could see it very early on with her attending these flying universities.
Yeah, you're right. It's a theme that continues to come up. And as we get into some of her discoveries, we see that love for Poland, never really escapes her, even when she moves to France. So moving on with her life, she turns 18. Her and her sister are both looking to further their education. They realize they can't do that in Poland due to everything we've just spoken about. So she struck a deal with her sister because there's a lot of expense of moving to a different country, paying for your education, paying for housing, that kind of stuff. And so she struck a deal with her sister where Marie would work as a governess to the daughters of a Russian nobleman, while her sister would go to Paris and study medicine. And then the plan was, once her sister graduated, became a doctor, she would start working and fund Marie to go to Paris to study. So that was their plan. Her sister went first, and then Marie followed in 1891, where she lived in very, very modest conditions, where she was studying physics and chemistry and mathematics at the University of Paris. And we got to remember too, she's speaking Polish. That's her first language. Coming to France, trying to learn French was definitely something she struggled with early on, but she really did well in her coursework. But she was known for someone who just would, didn't have much, but, would use everything that she had. So there's always stories of her just wearing all of her clothing in the winter because she didn't have like a proper winter jacket or anything. She'd just wear everything. She'd focus so hard on her studies that she would forget to eat sometimes. And so she was known for kind of neglecting her health a little bit and trying to just, focus so much on what she wants to do. So you definitely see this obsession with, we talked about she's breaking the law to be educated. Now she's kind of neglecting some of the basic things of life just to further that education because it's something that's so important to her.
Yeah, I think it almost speaks to this utilitarian kind of idea of hers, right? I think we'll see other examples of it as we talk about her career and the labs that she worked in. But what does it take to get the job done ultimately, end of the day? And if no frills are needed, then why even bother with them? And there's also this level of obsession that we see with her as well. And I think, again, we've talked about a couple scientists now who are, at the upper echelon of like scientific discovery. And they're all kind of like this in a weird way.
You're so right, because we've talked Oppenheimer, we've talked Einstein. You hear these stories of just absolute dedication to something. Like, to be able to get to these levels where you have to be obsessed, you probably have to have some level of OCD to some degree just to dive into something. There's no way that you would get to a point where you're thinking so outside the box that you don't have this obsession over what you're trying to accomplish.
There's almost like a level of neuroses in a weird way. Like Oppenheimer, I think the story goes, like, didn't he try to poison one of his teachers or tutors at some point?
When he was in England, yeah. Yeah, there's always, like we've talked about, I think to get to this level, there's always just something different with the way the brains are wired of some of these scientists. And if they're able to channel it in the right way, you get some really, really great outcomes. But it always seems like there's something along the fringes where they're maybe socially a little bit awkward or just so obsessed with what they're trying to do that, sometimes they neglect other parts of their life. So with Marie, she continues her studies. She earns a degree in physics in 1893 and then a second degree in mathematics in 1894, placing second in her class. She also started working in the lab of Gabriel Lippmann, who was a Nobel laureate already, and he's the man you can thank for color photography. So I can give him a thank you if you you like to take pictures. And so for Maria, right, you can start to see what kind of time period this is for science. Like, you move to Paris, you start studying, you excel, and there's a Nobel laureate there who you can go study under. There's a lot of scientific work coming in Paris, and there's a lot of great people studying. And Marie's finding herself in a really great spot. So she started to conduct her first research into the magnetic properties of different steel, which ends up leading her to meet a man named Pierre Curie, who they will get acquainted very, very soon. So she's in this world, she's learning, studying, and she meets a man who's going to change her life forever.
It's funny how in history sometimes things just seem to fall in place, but it's not necessarily like the right way to look at it, considering where she started from. But sometimes opportunity has a funny way of presenting itself to some of these, historical figures that we talk about.
Yeah, I always like to think, like, are we talking about them because it all worked out, and the ones that it didn't work out for, we're not talking about, I guess. But you're right. You just look along their lives, and there's so many things that have to go right. There's so much luck that needs to come into it. But then you also see how they handle their setbacks, and we'll get into it with Marie later in her life on some of those setbacks. And you can take one road or you can take another. And I think for people to get to a level of someone like Marie, you have to, take the opportunities that are given to you, because a lot of people don't do that, or you have to be able to pivot when things go poorly. So that's just, I think, kind of what we see with a lot of these figures, but also it's just having good people around you. And I think that's kind of probably the perfect transition to introduce Pierre to this, because she meets Pierre Curie, and they're both passionate about science. They're both politically aligned, and they fell in love really, really quickly. And Pierre was already a big name in the scientific world. So now you kind of have people who love their work, love everything that they do, and just kind of hit it off. Pierre had discovered something called piezoelectricity with his brother Jacques. And they currently were the head of a laboratory at the School of Industrial Physics and Chemistry, where they trained engineers. So at least at this time, I guess, quote unquote, engineering in the way we think about it today was not maybe as defined as much. It was more of this like industrial or applied physics. So you kind of see Pierre working in this space where he's training these engineers based on a lot of the theories, but he's trying to also bring the practical side to it outside of the theory. Because when we talked about Einstein, it was very much on the theoretical side. When we look at chemists, they definitely kind of leak more towards the engineering side, because at least at this time, there was so much going on around manufacturing and building things, and there was a lot of money in it too. So you do kind of see a little bit of that happen. So they continue to, follow their intellectual curiosities. They, would sit and just talk about scientific theories for hours. They love to ride bikes together, in Paris, right? Like think of the most quintessential Paris couple, riding bikes together, sitting on a picnic blanket, talking about whatever, drinking some wine. I kind of imagine this is how Marie and Pierre would enjoy their days. There is a bit of romanticism to this relationship. And I think we'll see the bonds that kind of tied them together as we keep talking about it. But, I don't think this wasn't a traditional relationship in any way, shape or form. Like they were very much equals when it came to, their contributions, not just to their relationship, but to the broader scientific community, even with Pierre kind of, already being established within it. Yeah, but you're so right, because this very easily could have been Pierre's established, let's have a family. Marie goes, great, I've done everything I need to do. I'm going to go take the traditional female role. But as we know with Marie, there's no chance that was ever going to happen. And I think, someone like Pierre, he's buying into Marie just as much as she's buying into him. And we'll see a little bit on how he even takes it a step further, and, never mind breaking traditional values, maybe flipping it on its head is something that he was ready to do. So he's in love with Marie. He knows she's perfect for him, and the man doesn't mess around. So he proposes after a pretty short amount of time. And she rejects him because she thinks that her aim was always to return to Poland. She wanted to go and work at the university there and just kind of be back with her family. And we know that, she really, really loves her country. So Pierre said, fine, I'll give up my career and I'll move to Poland with you. And so I'm sure Marie was like, okay, well, that's an interesting proposition. So she does end up going back to Poland just to visit her family, and she applies for a place at the Krakow University, but she's immediately rejected just because she's a woman. So as fate would have it, Pierre still gets to study, Marie gets to study, but they're going to have to do it in Paris. So she moves back and basically says, all right, Pierre, I can't move to Poland. I don't know what I'm going to do. And I think this is interesting because you can tell for sure how their marriage is they're seeing that this is going to go down what Marie needs to do. Like if Marie can't work and be a scientist, this isn't going to work. And Pierre's and maybe a little bit more up in the air, or maybe just a little love struck at this time. But they do end up coming back and getting married in 1895 in the suburbs of Paris. And I'm going to say a lot of, this is classic Marie, and we'll see as we go along, is she didn't want to wear, the white wedding dress. She wore a dark blue outfit as her bridal dress, which she ended up just using as one of her lab outfits in the future anyways. So very practical, very down to earth, doesn't need the spectacular. She's just there to, get things done. So, we have the famous Curies now are married, and boys, is this the start of, you want to say the definition of a power couple? I don't think anybody even comes close to these two, and we'll get into a lot of these things, but you've got two absolute geniuses together, working together, going to have kids of their own, starting a family. It's a pretty much a great match for both of them. It's such an unconventional relationship for this time, right? And I think it's definitely worth emphasizing, because I think in the modern era, it's something that is much more reasonable and expected and commonplace versus, we're talking about the late 19th to early 20th century, where this kind of give and take in a relationship is almost unheard of. He's willing to throw away his entire career to move back to Poland to support her, dreams and desires of being close to family, being back in her country. And, to the loss of the Krakow University, she ends up in Paris. Yeah, let's talk about a win for the French here on this one, right? especially with a couple wars coming up, which we'll get into, and all the things that are changing, right? You want to have as many smart scientists on your side as you can. And, it worked out very, very well for the French people and the Parisian people. So, here's Marie and Pierre. They're going to start researching and doing science because what else would they do? So Marie's early research focused on uranium rays, building on the work of Henri Becquerel. Henri had taken these uranium salts, and he noticed that they had an effect on these photographic plates through paper, even though the sun wasn't shining. So basically, like, he was seeing an image being pushed onto these plates, even though there was no light. And so if you think of just pick up a rock and it's essentially glowing and it's hot for no apparent reason, like you haven't done anything to it. This is something that people started to realize was there's something going on here. There's got to be something more to this element or there's got to be something in there that's doing these things. And this is where Marie starts to spend her time researching. So one of the challenges was and I think one of the other things too at this time to mention is science is evolving in a way where the experimental side is starting to catch up to the theory. And Pierre is actually a very, very good experimentalist, and he designs a machine that can help Marie measure the energy that's coming out of these uranium rocks, basically, or these uranium salts. And, it's detecting these rays at a very, very minute rate. And what she discovers very quickly is that the element thorium gives off the same rays as uranium, and concluded that it wasn't the arrangement of the atoms that was doing this. It's actually within the atom itself. So think of this as you have two different rocks and they're both hot and they're both doing their own thing, but at their core, there's different elements in there, but they're releasing the exact same type of rays. And so she was able to kind of look into this, and next thing you know, she's come up with the term radioactivity. So you can thank Marie Curie for radioactivity. And it's such a fundamental discovery, because if we have four fundamental forces in physics, you have gravity, electromagnetism, the strong nuclear force, and the weak nuclear force. And so Marie has discovered one of the four most foundational forces in the entire universe. And she's discovered something about the atom that nobody has known before. And this is going to kick off an explosion of research all around Europe and with her herself. And it's something that, there's so many things today that are based off this main discovery. So this is a really, really big discovery for her. But again, she's not just going to sit quietly and go, great, I discovered it, I'm going to walk away. She's going to kind of take this as a springboard to discover a lot more things.
It's such a good point. And I think probably some additional context just to kind of lay, the backdrop of her discovery and what's going on in science right now. We're talking about the late 19th or early 20th century. And historians have kind of referred to this as the, second scientific revolution, which essentially laid the foundation of modern science and technology. So along with Marie's work, you have other advances in physics. We talked about electromagnetism, thermodynamics, quantum theory. You have advances in chemistry, the development of the periodic table, atomic theory, and then ultimately radioactivity as well. Cell theory, genetics, electricity and magnetism, telecommunications. So this era is essentially an arena of some of the greatest minds coming together and coming up with, discoveries and findings that are going to shape the rest of the modern world and the trajectory of, technology and science as we see it. And Marie plays a crucial part in this broad landscape.
Yeah, it really is this explosion of different knowledge and everything like that. And I think too, we've seen, there's better ways for communication. There is a kind of emphasis on education as well, and government investment. Some of the new experimental stuff is catching up, and it's just, there's so much going on, and you can start to see someone learns something and then someone builds on that. And next thing you know, you have, a discovery like radioactivity. So you're right. Yeah, it's quite the interesting time. So if we come back to Marie, she starts to look into uranium ore a little bit more, and she realizes that it's giving off 2 to 4 times more radiation than expected if it was just uranium. So she's like, there's got to be something more here. There's maybe a different element or something going on, but uranium there's way too much radioactivity coming out of this. So she would put in a lot of work, and she worked in what she called her miserable old shed. So basically they had this really, really poor, just a bad quality workshop in the middle of Paris somewhere. And she would take this backbreaking work where she would fill these enormous vats with something called pitch blende, which is like this, like a uranium ore composite sort of thing. And she would basically dissolve it in acid to separate all the elements. So if anybody is working with uranium and acid, they are covered head to toe in a lot of protective gear. Marie's got none of that. She's just pouring uranium in and acid and getting to work. So it goes to show with her, hey, I don't mess around. I'm here to get the job done, but also nobody really knew the effects of radioactivity at this time. And this will be important as her life goes on around, spending your life around radioactive material and acids and these sort of things. It's definitely going to take a toll. So as she started doing this work, she separated out these atoms, and then boom, huge discovery. She discovers that there's 2 new elements that have never been discovered that she's been able to break apart. And they both are very, very radioactive, and they end up calling one radium, which is basically named after radioactivity. But the second one I like, and it goes back to her love for Poland, and she calls the element polonium, which is named after her homeland of Poland. So to question of, she moved to France and she's living this French lifestyle and doing all these things, but at the end of the day, she's still very, very devout Polish lady. She, to name an element after your country, right? Like, it's something that's never, if you go forward in life, like, it's never going to change. And as countries change and the world changes, the name of the element is never going to change. So this is something that I think, like, if you're a Polish person thinking about Marie's, impact on kind of Polish society, like, this is huge, right? There's not many that are named after a country.
I think it's incredible in so many ways. One, again, it goes back to her pride in, and that sentiment of, like, nationalism for Poland. But in this also kind of, like, perverse way, it could be this kind of, like, radical act of, like, protest against what's going on. Like,
I like that.
Right? There's an element of that in my mind, at least, where it's like, you know what? I know what's going on back home. I know there's a lot of oppression. In the face of that, I'm going to name this newfound element polonium. Take that, Russia.
Yeah, I like that. Even if that's not true, I'm going with that, because I think that's
right?
just kind of a very cool move. On it's like, the newspaper drops on the Tsar's desk and it's 2 new elements discovered, and wait, what? Polonium? Where did that come from, right? Yeah, I think that's pretty awesome. And I think there's definitely some element to a bunch of different things there. But yeah, at the end of the day, she loves her country, and, maybe even a little bit of, to remember her father and the people around her that really suffered is, I think it's pretty awesome. So she discovers these 2 elements, and her and Pierre continue to research so from between 1898 and 1902, they jointly or separately put together about 32 different scientific papers around all the different things that they found around radioactivity, including one that announced that when exposed to radium, diseased tumor-forming cells were destroyed faster than healthy cells. So we know today when someone has cancer and they go for radiation, this is where that kind of first discovery started, was people were starting to realize that the medical applications for radioactivity are going to be massive. And this is kind of the start of that journey. So they're starting to get a little bit of notoriety now. They've, again, discovered 2 elements. That's definitely going to help, but starting to understand the medical applications and all these other things, they're starting to get all this attention. And so Marie becomes the first woman faculty member at a school in Paris, and then Pierre gets a full-time faculty role at the University of Paris. And then in about 3 years later, our old friend Gabriel Lippmann, who's the color photography guy and Nobel laureate, Marie is awarded her doctorate working under him at the University of Paris. And then she was invited they were both invited to the Royal Institute of London to give a speech on radioactivity. But of course, Marie's a woman, so she's prevented from speaking, and Pierre had to go alone. So again, this is just a story Marie's going to continue to face as she goes along. But with all this fanfare and all of these things, they never patent any of the things that they discover. They never try to start a business around any of it. They don't really seem to be interested in the financial gains of this. It's just the love of science and the love of discovery. And so there's this huge industry being built around all of these radioactive materials. And like I mentioned, the medical properties, but they don't really seem to have an interest in it. They're there for the science, and they're going to continue moving forward. So, and they'll continue to do so. But yeah, it's just definitely not a financial gain, or definitely wasn't a financial endeavor for either of them.
It's funny. 2 thoughts came to mind while you were speaking. One, Marie Curie, great scientist, bad capitalist. Second was just, when she's invited to the Royal Society to speak and she doesn't have the opportunity, even in an arena like science, where we think about, the merit of knowledge and discovery kind of speaking for itself, you can still see like the social and cultural mores and how pervasive they are, even within a community that we often see as very progressive.
Yeah, it's true, right? Because you have to be progressive to push the envelope in science. Exactly. You have to think differently. And unfortunately, I guess a lot of these places are still an old boys club at the end of the day. And they definitely feel threatened by Marie, and they see this as, encroachment into whatever they think is their world. But, that's sign of the time, unfortunately. But thankfully, things are starting to change, and a lot of people around her are recognizing her talent, and even Albert Einstein and her become friends later in life. So she's doing all these great things. It's 1903, and it's time to award the next Nobel Prize. And the Curies are the winners alongside Henri Becquerel for winning and they'll win the Nobel Prize in Physics for, quote, in recognition of their extraordinary services they have rendered by their joint research on the radiation phenomena discovered by Professor Henri Becquerel. So the three of them are winners. However, this was not always the case. When the committee first decided who they were going to give the Nobel Prize to, they left Marie out. It was just going to be Pierre and Henri. But a committee member who was an advocate for female scientists at the time let Pierre know about the situation, saying, okay, they're specifically not including Marie in this situation. And so Pierre, loving his wife and understanding that she's just as much a big piece in this as he is, basically argues it and fights back, saying, no, you have to include Marie in this. And eventually they give in, making Marie Curie the first woman to ever win a Nobel Prize.
It's pretty exceptional in an era, speaking in 2024, the amount of discussion we have around advocacy and its importance. This to me is one of those like amazing historical examples of just how important having someone in your corner is to advocate for you. Your husband, you have another a world-renowned scientist who is willing to come to bat and say, no, there's absolutely no way you're going to leave Marie out of this. She was an equal part of this work, if not more so. And I think it just goes to show in some cases historically, like just how important advocacy really is.
It's a great point, and she's so lucky to have someone like Pierre around her, and I think he's lucky to have someone like Marie. But to the point where her name's on all these papers, everybody knows who's met her, how smart she is, but somebody is going to have their old traditional hat on and say, well, she's probably just tacking on to all of Pierre's work. This is really Pierre, and he's just throwing his wife a bone here. But Pierre knows, right? And it's not a great situation, but you're right. There's the advocacy, the people step up and say, hey, we're going to make a change here. And hey, it kind of unleashes Marie onto the scene, and a lot of great discoveries come from that. And
the crazy part is like the breadth of work is there, right? It's not like she just showed up out of nowhere with no papers published, no scientific career. She is someone with an astounding amount of pedigree. So, it's like the gall of the community at this point to say, I don't know, is pretty wild.
Yeah, and she's got a PhD from a Nobel laureate in the University of Paris, and especially then too, where it's like getting your PhD, there's only a very, very small amount of people who have it. So yeah, again, it's just good old fashioned sexism, I guess, at this point. And hey, we're lucky that it was at this time and she was in, things worked out in that case, but yeah, it definitely could have gone the other way without some advocacy. So she wins the Nobel Prize. They get a bunch of money for this. They give birth to their second daughter. So that's really exciting. So they've got a little family here. They've got some money. And things are really looking great for the Curies. Their life is moving forward. But life is just not fair, quite frankly. And on April 19th, 1906, Pierre Curie is killed in a road accident. So he's crossing the street in Paris in heavy rain, and he was struck by a horse-drawn vehicle, fell under the wheels, fracturing his skull, and unfortunately killing him instantly. So, a 19th century or a 1900 or early 1900s car crash, for lack of a better term. So this is just devastating for Marie. Obviously, she's got 2 kids. She's just won this Nobel Prize. Pierre has been her rock, everything that she needs. She's able to retain the chair at the physics department of the University of Paris. That was originally Pierre's. They gave it to Marie after his death, and she became the first woman professor at the University of Paris. So right away, hey, this is great, but like at what cost, right? So this is definitely this transformative moment in her life, and it's really, it's just devastating for her, especially after everything they've been through, everything that they've accomplished. They have 2 young girls. You can't put yourself in her shoes and really understand what she was going through.
Yeah, the shock of this loss for her, I can't even imagine what it felt like. This isn't just, again, I think it goes back to one of the points that we talked about earlier. Like, this is not a conventional relationship in any way, shape, or form. This is literally her partner in her career and life. To lose someone that has been so foundational and so supportive of her, it must have been earth-shattering.
Yeah, you're right. It's not just even losing a husband, but like it's losing your partner, right? Your partner that you've done everything with from a scientific perspective, your research partner, your person you've accomplished everything with. So it's a pretty tough time for Marie. So she does what's the sensible thing, and she gets her family closer to Pierre's family. So she has some help from Pierre's father in raising their kids and that kind of stuff, because Marie's going all over the place to conferences all around the world. And she starts to write these letters to her daughters saying like, I wish I could be there for you, but I got to be here. I got to do this. I got to be in the lab and all of these things. And you really see this divide coming in her life where she loves her science and she wants to dedicate herself to that, but she also loves her family, and she's really struggling to balance the two. And especially without Pierre there, like, she'd be in the lab working with Pierre, and there's still a family element to it. This is sometimes her alone time, ways to kind of get away. But we know if anything about Marie is when she dives into something, she really goes hard for it. And trying to balance that with her family was really, really difficult for her. So, she's kind of getting lonely, and she's trying to you can see this coping and all these sort of things. So it's really, really tough for her. And so, when someone's lonely, right, there's a few different ways you can go about it. And Marie, she's a single lady. She finds a lover. So she finds a man named Paul Langevin, who unfortunately though was a married man with 4 kids. So
tough.
Yeah. Again, nothing wrong with it from Marie's perspective. This is more of a, hey, you're married, buddy. You gotta, get in line. But this scientist's wife finds out. He claims, I think the whole thing was they were about to be separated and it was a bit of a gray area. But again, besides the point, she discovered this affair. And the rumor is that she leaked it to a tabloid newspaper. And despite everybody kind of trying to hush it up, and actually this scientist threatening to duel the journalist who broke the story. So I think this has something to do with Marie's charm. Pierre's willing to give up his whole career for her just to be with her. This man is willing to duel a journalist over something that's going to destroy her reputation. Obviously, the duel doesn't happen, and the story was broke and basically destroys Marie's credibility. So she's seen as this homewrecker and just this kind of evil woman who's kind of gone in between this, think of this quintessential loving French family, and this foreign woman comes in and kind of muscles her way in and ruins everything. So it's perfect tabloid fodder. But obviously, like, this is, it's just a bunch of slander and it's a bunch of garbage. But this actually affects her reputation a lot, because remember, people are not happy with, her being a woman and all these sort of things in science. And there's a lot of pushback against that. This is the ultimate fire that these people need. And it really, really does a lot to hurt her credibility, unfortunately. Yeah.
And I think it's a sign of the time, sadly, where she's the one that's painted in this, maniacal way as this homewrecker. The husband, who's the married one, I imagine he probably got a bit of backlash, but more or less it seems like the focal point on, who was really to blame became Marie, as a woman, as this homewrecker who, kind of interloped with this married man and ruined his marriage and his home life. But, it takes 2 to tango, and it's such an unfair brushing of what she did and how she's kind of ultimately culpable for what happened.
For sure. And I think, remember when we did our Marie Antoinette episode about 100 years earlier, but the French definitely like to pick on females who are foreign because it is an easy target for them. And this is the same thing, right? It's that same sort of, thought process of, you're a female, you're going to take kind of unfair stick for certain things. And then being from a different country to not being like a proper French person, they definitely they don't see too well with that. But this doesn't stop Marie, because quite frankly, not much can stop her at this point. So she's actually was up for a second Nobel Prize, and it almost got taken away or not awarded to her because of this whole situation. But again, she's such a juggernaut at this time of scientific talent, and there's enough people kind of advocating for her that she actually does win a second Nobel Prize. So she wins it this time in chemistry. So she won the first one in physics, this one in chemistry. And so we got to stop and just remember how monumental of a thing this is. So not only is she the first woman to win 1 Nobel Prize, she's the first woman to win 2 Nobel Prizes. But today in 2024, she's only one of 5 people ever to win 2 Nobel Prizes, and the only in history to win a Nobel Prize in 2 different scientific fields. So there's some people who've won like a Nobel Peace Prize and a physics Nobel Prize, or literature and something else. The only person to do it in physics and chemistry is Marie Curie.
It just goes to show the relentlessness and just her mental faculties, right? I think it is just so incredible that that's still held, as this kind of record. And I don't know if it'll ever be beat. It's hard to even wrap your head around this level of accomplishment.
Yeah, I think because she got it in physics for discovering radioactivity with Pierre and Henri, and it was this, just putting a theory behind some sort of physical phenomenon, but then to actually go and do kind of that experimental work, a little bit of that engineering work, a little bit more of that practical work to separate out those two elements, the chemists, and that's more of a classical chemistry type of thing. And then being able to win it in that. And it's almost kind of two separate things in the sense, they're related, but almost kind of two kind of different ways of thinking about it. And again, it goes to show her deep, deep understanding of the scientific theory, but her also ability to, get her hands dirty when she needs to and kind of get down to brass tacks and build something practical out of all of this. And, she's able to accomplish so much from that and kind of move forward, which brings us to, if you've been counting the years, you're probably thinking there's some world wars around the corner, aren't there? And you would be correct. So 1914, World War I kicks off. And it's funny because you see this patriotism with Marie as she obviously loves Poland very much, but France has been her home for a long time. And first thing she does is, how can I help the French in this war? So the first thing she does is she goes to the bank and she says, I would like you to melt down my Nobel Prize medals and take the gold and use it to support the war effort, which they say, no, Marie, we can't do that. We're not going to melt down your Nobel Prizes. She goes, okay, fine, but I'll buy a bunch of war bonds with all my, Nobel Prize money. So financially, she's already pushing money towards the war effort. And then she starts to realize that this X-ray technology that's kind of being developed based on some of her discoveries and a lot of work being done at this time, there's the ability to help people on the battlefield. So she developed with a small team these mobile units that would go around and essentially X-ray soldiers on the front lines to help with surgeries. And they call them little Curies. So she needed an assistant, and who better than her daughter, Irene? So basically very talented, very scientifically literate, only 17 years old. The two of them and a military doctor driving out to the front lines and taking hundreds and hundreds of X-rays over the entire war. And, Irene follows her mother's example, and I like kind of this wording of they just dove headfirst into the dangers of overexposed X-rays, didn't have any shielding or anything like that. But again, job had to be done. Soldiers were dying. We got to get out there and do our thing. And, over that war, there's, no number put on the amount of lives that were saved by her and her team, basically, understanding how these surgeons need to operate on these people and just, understanding what's going on inside the body to be able to save a lot of lives. I'm sure the number's in the hundreds, maybe potentially even more, but it's a lot of great work from her. And she was never, though, fully recognized by the French government. Irene was, but Marie wasn't, because that affair was still sticking in, I think, people's minds a little bit of, we can't let her get away with that. And I'm not a big fan of hers, but her daughter, young and, born in France and has those French genetics, like, sure, for sure. Let's do that. But for Marie, not so much. But again, let's just add to this. 2 Nobel Prizes, discovering things that never existed before. And then let's just tack on, oh yes, and she's a war hero. So let's just tack that on top of this unbelievable resume.
And she wasn't even asked, right? Like, no one asked her to do it. She put her money where her mouth was. Brass tacks. How can I help? How can I apply what I know and help the war effort? There was no volunteering. Like, she wasn't conscripted. This was, I need to do something. And again, I think it just goes to show so much about her personality and character.
Yeah, there's no backing down. There's no, you can see with her is, well, the war broke out. Well, the right thing to do is support it in any way I can. Well, I have these Nobel Prize medals just sitting here. I might as well melt them down and help other people. Like, it's always pushing the envelope in some way. And I think the only fault Marie probably has in her life is really not caring for herself and her health and her mental state is maybe as much as she should have. But at the same time, look what she accomplished. So can you really blame her? And, and if Pierre had still been alive, that may have helped a little bit, but hey, this is who she is. And, she's not going to stop. The war's done. She's not hanging them up and saying, all right, I've had a good life on the scientific discovery train. Let's kind of take a pause. So the war ends, a few years go by, and she starts by doing a tour of the United States to raise funds for research on radium, and actually receives 1 gram of radium collected in the United States that's presented to her by President Harding in 1921. And, the first lady praised her as being, not just a great professional achiever, but also a very supportive wife. So all of this happens. It's the 20s, right? We're getting a little bit better, but it's still like,
a lot of work.
And you're a great wife. It's like, thanks. My husband's been dead for like 20 years. So it's a little bit of, we know how it is. But there's something that's happening here is she's going around abroad, and she doesn't really have any official title from the French government. The French are starting to get a little embarrassed by this because they never gave her any awards for her war stuff. They never gave her any awards for winning these Nobel Prizes because of this affair. And so they finally say, okay, Marie, sorry about all this. We're going to give you the Legion of Honor, one of the highest civilian awards you can get. And what do you think Marie does? She goes, no way, I don't want that. I know why you're doing this. And I just love that, right? Because that's, again, classic Marie, right? She's not enticed so much by the titles and the awards and the money. She just does what's the right thing in her eyes. And in this case, she's like, what do I need that for? It's a little silly. So yeah, I just love that little piece on, she's so popular. She's so famous now, and she's so confident in herself that, you know, she doesn't need some silly award from the French government.
Well, it's kind of rich for the French government to pretend, you know, to have this kind of blasphemous outlook of her for having an affair, knowing what we know about the French in general.
Yeah, it's, I don't even, yeah, you can just sit back and laugh, I think is really all you can do at this point. So moving on with her life, she becomes a fellow at the French Academy of Medicine. She's traveling all over the world, Belgium, Brazil, Spain, Czechoslovakia, giving all of these lectures. And she starts a institute in Paris to study radioactivity and everything that's kind of within her neck of the woods. And this institute actually produces 4 more Nobel Prize winners. And one of them is her daughter, Irene. Her daughter, Irene, and her husband, Frederick, are actually Nobel Prize winners for discovering, I think it was artificial radiation or radioactivity. So I just love this too, right? Of Irene kind of literally going through the trenches with her mother on the front lines of World War I, and then following her footsteps, studying, and then also marrying somebody who is of the same caliber in terms for like an intellectual level. And winning a Nobel Prize. And the one thing I like about Irene too, she hyphenates her name too. So you still have Curie in there as well, which I think is a smart move by her. But, you know, this is just great. Like, I think, you know, for Pierre to be able to see all of this and Marie to see all of this, like, especially everything that they've gone through, to see her daughter grow up and follow in their footsteps, like, you know, talk about proud parents. I think they must have been.
It doesn't even stop with Irene. So Marie and Pierre's other son-in-law, Henry, who had married their younger daughter, Eve Curie, he actually won a Nobel Prize for Peace on behalf of UNICEF, on which he was the executive director. So that totals 5 Nobel Prizes within that family. And her daughter was an accomplished journalist, newspaper publisher, and was a part of the French resistance movement during World War II, and her mother's biographer.
What do you even say, right?
5 total.
Yeah. 5 Nobel Prizes, war hero, resistance fighter, guess a war hero as well. There's something in those genetics that, I would be curious to see where that bloodline's ended up today, because I wonder, because there's a lot of firepower there. So just kind of getting to the end of Marie's life here, she actually becomes a member of the League of Nations, which was a newly created international committee after World War I. And she sat on that committee until 1934, so almost 12 years. And she contributed to the League of Nations scientific coordination with other prominent researchers such as Albert Einstein. And we talked last week about how much Einstein was involved in kind of the political movements and the social movements. And there's a letter I was going to read on here, but I just realized the way Einstein writes, I don't know if it's just the way the translation is. It was just very, very wacky the way it was written. But the core of it was, when she was going through all this nonsense with the affair, basically Albert Einstein wrote her a letter basically saying, don't listen to anybody else. You are such a great person. You're a great scientist. We know who you are. This is just kind of the way it is. Just, you got to ignore it, move on. You know, we're all pulling for you, that kind of stuff, which I think was really great to, you know, hey, Albert Einstein's writing you a letter, number 1, but number 2, telling you to don't listen to these people, do what you need to do and kind of move forward. So I think that's just a nice little thing that, again, someone in your corner, it's Albert Einstein, you know, she's making really, really smart friends in high up places. So, you know, definitely goes to help her out a little bit. And
like reorienting her towards what really matters, right? You know, socially, you know, personally, emotionally, you can have your opinions about the affair. That's fine. But ultimately what he's saying is focus on your work and keep driving it forward. You know, regardless of what's happening outside of it, keep pushing the envelope.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think for all those people at that time, right, like, you know, she was definitely lonely, definitely in a tough spot. And, you know, to have a little bit of a kick in the rear and be like, remember, you're Marie Curie, right? You're two-time Nobel Prize winner. Why you don't worry about this. Like nobody's even close to your level. So to kind of wrap up with her life, in 1934, she gets very, very sick. She has a condition where bone marrow is not producing enough new blood cells. And really, this is more probably than not linked to all of the high doses of radiation that she's experienced in her life. And so she passes away at the age of 66 with, so many accomplishments, even by the age of 66. And we even look today when people live, into getting Nobel Prizes in their 70s or 80s after so much work. She's already got 2 in her belt before the war even breaks out. Then you add on, all of the other things. But the final thing the Parisian people do and the French people do is in 1995, they moved her remains into the Pantheon in Paris. And previously to that, there were no women who were buried in the Pantheon based on their own merits. There was like wives of men who were put in there and things like that. But she's the first where they said, Marie, you're in here and you're going to be honored with the great French, men and women from history. So again, the French seem to be a little late in the game on the Marie Curie show because I don't really know. I guess if the affair still had some, shock some people's minds, but hey, 2 Nobel Prizes, war hero. She's finally getting the respect she deserves in Paris and in France, but also back in Poland. She's a national hero in Poland, and really this great example of someone who represented 2 nations and dedicated her life to not just the scientific discovery, but to the people of both of those nations.
What an astounding life. You said 66 she passed away?
Yeah, 66 in 1934.
Yeah, it's amazing she lived that long, considering how close she was working with like radioactive material her whole life.
Yeah, I'm telling you, she's built differently, right? And we say they're built differently back then, but she's built differently for people who were built differently. So, she's a bit of a tank, and she's not going to, she's going through all of these things. And again, she managed to make it through a war too, on top of, she went into a war and got blasted with radiation throughout the entire war and still lived for another 20 plus years. So again, she's built differently.
You can even, she wore the wounds of her work, right? Like there's examples of her hands. There's like this famous image of her hand and it looks like it's decaying. This is prior to her death, just because of how much radioactive material she handled. And another great example of this is her notebooks, which are actually held in lead-lined containers because of how radioactive they are. And it's presumed they're going to be radioactive for the next 1,500 years.
How the heck did she live till 66 is the question I have, right?
It's incredible.
Yeah. There's something there where I don't know. Nobody really knows, but yeah, to be around that much radiation and to live to 66 and to even do it effectively too, you think all that radiation would, start to slow you down a little bit. But I don't think she would take no for an answer. So, hey, that's Marie. And I think if I, were to compare her to some of the other people we've talked about in history, I'm putting her up there in, the top people we've talked about, because I think to hold the, 2 Nobel Prizes, one of the only people to ever do it. You're a war hero. If you were to link to like all the lives that have been saved based on her discoveries, with all the medical things that have happened that are based on her discovery to this time, the numbers in the millions, maybe the tens and hundreds of millions. So, not just impact in her time, but impact in our time. I don't think anybody really even comes close that we've talked about so far.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I think even just like on her own merit and accomplishments alone, let alone the circumstances in which she accomplished those, is even more incredible, right? This is not a very inclusive society. The barriers for a woman to accomplish these things, she is facing obstacle after obstacle, and she's still able to do it, coming from a very meager background as well.
Yeah, it's weird. I almost forgot that she had to go through all these barriers, because look at all the great things she comes from.
You take it for granted.
Yeah, you do.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Not knowing the language, having to leave your home, losing your husband, all of these sort of things, and it doesn't deter her. So yeah, I think when we're talking about great leaders and anything to do with people in general, you can look up to Marie. But I think you also have to remember too that like you don't have to go to Marie's limits to maybe accomplish what you need to accomplish. I think she's definitely an extreme example, and I don't even think it's a life you would want to emulate just based on how dedicated she was to what she did. But this is what it takes sometimes to get to the top, right? Is full sacrifice for a lot of things, and just kind of going head first into what you want to accomplish.
And I think on that point, I'd mentioned this at the top. I'm big on quotes, and I figured Marie probably had some really great quotes that we could share with our listeners. And I think this kind of sums up this discussion, her life, her perspective very, very well. And it is, life is not easy for any of us, but what of that? We must have perseverance and above all, confidence in ourselves. We must believe that we are gifted for something, and that is the thing must be attained.
I like that a lot. It's just, sure, yeah, life's hard. Life's hard, but just keep moving forward.
Yeah, it's perfect. I think that just kind of really just puts the perfect pin in our discussion about her life, her accomplishments, and just how she was able to accomplish so much.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to end, Richie. I think we can walk away and just, she's going to be sitting in our minds, I'm sure, as we continue on talking about other people. Like, she's great. They're great, but they're no Marie. So
they're not Marie.
I think that's a good way to end. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll be back in a couple of weeks, another episode.
Thanks everyone. Thank you for listening to today's episode of the History in Motion podcast. If you enjoyed our journey through time, please subscribe, rate us, and share the podcast with friends. Your support helps keep history alive. Until next time.